Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at a really interesting document called Georgia's Struggle for Western Integration.
And it's really a fascinating look at Georgia, kind of grappling with its identity and where it fits in on the world stage. And I think to really understand the complexities Georgia faces today, you really have to kind of go back in time and look back at its history.
Yeah, let's do that. I think that's always the case when we talk about any sort of political situation, right? Understanding the past is really key.
Absolutely.
So the document starts by taking us back to ancient Georgia, a land of ancient kingdoms, Colchis, Iberia, and actually I thought this was really interesting. Georgia adopted Christianity really early on, like 4th century A.D., which set it apart from its neighbors.
It did. It played a huge role, I think, in shaping Georgian culture and identity and really, setting it apart from its neighbors. And, speaking of setting it apart, we can't overlook Georgia's location.
Right.
It's at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. And throughout history, this geographic positioning has made Georgia a target for various empires and powers because, they're seeking to control trade routes,
Yeah.
exert regional influence.
I mean, it's a land that's been both blessed and burdened by its location, I think.
100%.
It's given them, this incredible culture, incredible history,
Yeah.
but it's also made them a target.
A bit of a geopolitical football.
Exactly. And in the 19th century, facing threats from neighboring powers, Georgia was annexed by the Russian Empire. They were seeking protection, but ultimately, that meant losing their independence.
It did. And that annexation into the Russian Empire was, I think, a huge turning point for Georgia.
Yeah.
Because it brought about significant cultural and political changes, integrating Georgia more closely into the Russian sphere of influence.
Right.
And, after that, there was actually a brief period of independence between 1918 and 1921
Right.
following the Russian Revolution.
Just a little taste of it.
A little case, a brief moment, but ultimately short-lived.
Yeah, short-lived. And then after this brief taste of independence, Georgia was incorporated into the Soviet Union. So,
Yeah.
I mean, how did this period of Soviet rule impact them long term?
I think the Soviet period was really complex for Georgia. On one hand, it brought about modernization and industrialization, but on the other hand, that modernization and industrialization came at the cost of political repression. The document highlights how, despite those attempts at suppressing it, nationalist sentiments continued to simmer beneath the surface.
Yeah. And those simmering nationalist sentiments obviously played a crucial role in their drive for independence in 1991 when the Soviet Union itself started to crumble.
Absolutely. It was a year of immense change, all across Eastern Europe.
Right.
And for Georgia, 1991 marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with both hope and uncertainty.
For sure. And the early years of independence were, as we can imagine, tumultuous, marked by political instability, economic hardship, and internal conflict. The document introduces us to some key political figures who emerged during this time. We have Zviad Gamzakurdia, Georgia's first president, whose tenure was short-lived and marked by controversy.
Very much so. I mean, Gamzakurdia was, his leadership was divisive.
Yeah.
Some saw him as a champion of Georgian independence, but, others criticized his authoritarian tendencies. And ultimately, his rule ended in a coup in 1992.
Right.
Which I think, just goes to show how fragile the newly independent state was.
For sure. So after Gamzakuria's ousting, we have Eduard Shevardnadze. He was the former Soviet foreign minister, and he kind of took the helm, his goal being to stabilize the nation and guide it through this very turbulent transition.
Yeah, and he faced immense challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. He inherited a country struggling with a collapsed economy,
Of course.
widespread corruption,
Yeah.
ongoing conflicts in the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I mean, really a heavy lift.
Absolutely. Despite his efforts to bring some stability, Shevardnadze's leadership was also met with discontent, particularly due to perceptions of corruption and his inability to kind of effectively address the separatist conflicts.
Yeah, he was in a tough spot.
Yeah. And that dissatisfaction ultimately led to what we know as the Rose Revolution,
Right.
2003, this peaceful uprising that brought Mikhail Saakashvili to power. And this, I think, really ushered in a new era for Georgia.
It did.
Hmm.
And the Rose Revolution was a pivotal moment in Georgia's post-Soviet history. And Saakashvili, he was young, he was charismatic, he promised sweeping reforms and a decisive break from the past.
Yeah. Saakashvili's leadership was really marked by this drive to modernize Georgia and align it closer with the West.
Yeah, that was his goal.
Yeah.
He implemented anti-corruption measures, tried to streamline the bureaucracy, embarked on these ambitious infrastructure projects. He really was trying to kind of change things up.
Yeah. His reforms weren't without controversy, of course. I mean, some people praised this bold vision, this decisive leadership, but others criticized his method as being a little too authoritarian, a little too heavy-handed.
A little too strongmanish. You know, his tenure was a time of dramatic change, both positive and negative, and his reforms undoubtedly transformed Georgia in many ways.
Right.
But they also raised concerns about, you know, that concentration of power and maybe the erosion of democratic checks and balances.
Yeah. And it's something I think we see in a lot of these countries that are trying to transition.
Yeah.
It's this tension between, needing strong leadership to enact these reforms,
Right.
but also the importance of democratic principles.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And I think, just to add to the complexity, this balance is further complicated by Georgia's strategic location. Even as it undergoes these internal reforms, it remains a key player in a much larger geopolitical game. I mean, it's caught between the interests of Russia and the West.
Right. And I think that's where we're going to pick up next time because,
Yeah.
The document goes into this in detail and how Georgia's strategic importance as a transit corridor for energy pipelines and transportation networks connecting Europe and Asia makes it absolutely crucial.
Right. It's at the heart of these geopolitical tensions between Russia and the West.
Exactly. So we'll be back next time to look at that in more detail.
So picking back up here, in 2024, it was a pretty significant year for Georgia politically. We had those parliamentary elections in October.
Right. And the ruling Georgian Dream Party, they declared victory.
They did.
But immediately the opposition parties were saying, no, this wasn't fair, this wasn't right, there was fraud. And the United National Movement being one of the main ones.
The main opposition.
Saying, no, this is not how it should have gone down.
Yeah, and even international observers raised concerns about how the elections were conducted, pointing to, things like voter intimidation and ballot stuffing.
Right.
And they called for, a real investigation, and they even said, maybe we need to rerun these elections.
Right, under international supervision to make sure it's all above board. But the Georgian government, of course, dismissed all these concerns, saying, no, everything was free and fair, accusing the opposition of just trying to stir things up, destabilize the country, maybe even colluding with foreign powers.
Yeah, playing that card.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, this response really just poured fuel on the fire.
Oh, yeah.
And led to these mass protests all across the country.
Huge protests.
People saying, no, we want a new election, our votes were stolen.
Yeah.
You can't just cling to power.
Right.
Illegitimately.
Yeah. And, for the most part, the protests were peaceful.
Right.
But obviously the situation was really tense. There was definitely potential for things to escalate.
Of course. And I think the international community was really watching this closely, urging both sides, the government and the opposition to just,
cool it.
Yeah. Talk to each other, find a peaceful resolution.
Yeah. Come on, guys. Let's work this out.
Yeah. But then things kind of took a turn for the worse.
Yeah, they really did. The Georgian government made a pretty dramatic announcement.
Yeah. Basically suspending its EU accession talks.
Pretty much.
So effectively putting its bid for EU membership on hold.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously the opposition was outraged.
Yeah.
There was a lot of disappointment among the Georgian people. I
Yeah.
mean, the document highlights how important EU membership is for Georgia. It's not just some political or economic goal.
Right. It's this idea of belonging.
Yeah, this deep desire to be part of the European family, to share those values. And the Georgian government justified its decision by saying, look, the EU isn't treating us fairly. They're biased against us. They're listening to the opposition too much.
Right.
And they're using this accession process to pressure us.
Right. It's all political.
Yeah, it's political blackmail, basically, is what they were saying.
Right. Right. And I think it was probably driven by a lot of things.
It was probably a combination of factors.
Yeah. The government was frustrated with all this criticism about their democratic record.
Yeah, they didn't want to do all the reforms, make all the changes that the EU was asking for.
Right. And also maybe they thought, okay, if we distance ourselves from the West, Russia's going to, reward us.
Right. Maybe we'll get something out of this.
Right. But regardless, it was a big turning point in Georgia's relationship with the EU.
Yeah.
And it really raised some doubts about their commitment to democratic values, to the rule of law. I mean, these are the things the EU is all about.
That's the foundation of it.
Right. And this decision to suspend talks really just kind of deepened the political divide inside Georgia.
Absolutely. And it got even more interesting because then you have President Salome Zourabichvili coming out as a really strong critic of the government.
Right, so she's kind of going against her own government here.
Yeah, she's saying they're betraying the will of the people.
Yeah.
That they're jeopardizing Georgia's future by cozying up to Russia.
Yeah, and this is really significant.
It is.
Because it shows this real division.
Deep division.
Within the Georgian political elite.
Yeah.
Over the country's direction.
Absolutely. And then you have these opposition leaders like Nika Malia and Badri Japaridze who are really mobilizing the protests.
Right, keeping the pressure on in.
Yeah, they're calling for the prime minister to resign, new elections, recommitment to EU integration.
Right. I mean, it really just reflects how frustrated and disillusioned a lot of Georgians are feeling.
Yeah, they feel like their hopes for a democratic and European future are being ignored.
And we can't forget about those unresolved conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Oh, yeah.
These breakaway regions, backed by Russia, are a constant reminder of Georgia's vulnerability.
It's this open wound that just keeps getting poked at.
And it creates so much tension.
Yeah, and the document really goes into the history of these conflicts, you know, tracing it back to the fall of the Soviet Union, rise of ethnic tensions.
Right.
And, Russia really exploited this to their advantage. They intervened militarily in 2008 and just said, we're recognizing the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
And that essentially froze the conflict.
Yeah.
Leaving them as these de facto Russian protectorates.
Right. And that's a huge problem for Georgia.
Right.
Because it challenges their sovereignty and their ability to integrate with the West.
Right. NATO is not going to let them in with foreign troops on their soil.
Exactly. It's a non-starter.
Yeah. So Georgia's facing a lot of problems.
There's a lot of problems.
It's both internal, the political polarization, the corruption, and then these external pressures from Russia and these unresolved conflicts.
Yeah. It's a tough spot.
But the document does highlight, the resilience of the Georgian people.
Yeah.
Their desire for freedom, democracy, that European future. I mean, they're still pushing for reforms.
They're not giving up.
They want a better future.
Absolutely. And I think this brings us to, one of the key internal challenges that the document really dives into. And that's the issue of corruption.
Right. It's a huge problem.
It's everywhere. It undermines trust in government. It hurts economic development.
And it's deeply entrenched in the system.
Oh, yeah. The political system, the judiciary. I mean, it's everywhere.
Right. And it's something that really needs to be addressed if Georgia wants to move forward.
It has to be addressed. If they're serious about, democratic consolidation and joining the EU, they have to tackle this.
Right. And another issue closely linked to this is the political polarization.
Yeah, the divide between the ruling party and the opposition.
It's so deep.
It's toxic.
Yeah.
It's all personal attacks. There's no real dialogue. Nobody's trying to work together.
And the media landscape just kind of fuels this fire.
Oh, yeah. Every outlet is aligned with one side or the other.
Right.
And it's all just propaganda and misinformation.
Right. So the document's saying we need a more independent media.
Absolutely. One that can provide objective information.
Right. And foster real debate.
Yeah. And we also need to protect freedom of speech, make sure that journalists can do their jobs without being censored or intimidated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of the judiciary.
Yeah.
And whether or not it's truly independent.
There are a lot of questions about that.
Yeah. And there have been cases of political interference, lack of accountability.
Yeah. And that erodes public trust in the rule of law.
Right. And if there's no trust in the legal system, how can you function as a democracy?
Exactly. It creates this environment of uncertainty and impunity.
Right.
And it raises concerns about whether Georgia can really meet the standards required for EU membership.
Right, because that's a core principle.
Absolutely.
So the document is saying that because of all these problems, the corruption, the political system, the courts, that's why the EU hit pause on the accession talks.
Yeah. They're saying, look, you guys got to make some serious progress in these areas if you really want to join the club.
Right. So what does all this mean for Georgia's future? It seems like they're at a real crossroads.
Yeah, pulled in a lot of different directions.
Right. And I know the document doesn't, try to predict the future.
It doesn't.
But it does paint a pretty realistic picture.
It does. It lays out the challenges and, of course, the opportunities.
Right. Because there are opportunities for Georgia.
Of course, they've made a lot of progress.
They have.
Since independence, but there are some serious roadblocks ahead.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest things is this balancing act they have to do with Russia and the West.
Yeah. How do you safeguard your sovereignty
Right.
and pursue those Western aspirations without making Russia angry?
Right. Because Russia's right there.
Right there.
And they've shown they're not afraid to use force.
Or economic pressure. I mean, any move that Georgia makes that Russia sees as a threat,
Right.
they're going to react.
So what can Georgia do? I mean, the document does offer some suggestions.
Yeah. They say the best bet is to really focus on strengthening those democratic institutions.
Right. Make the country stronger from the inside.
Exactly. And diversify the economy so they're not so reliant on Russia.
Right. A strong democracy and a thriving economy, that makes them a much more appealing partner for the West.
Right. And a harder target for Russia.
Yeah. And they also talk about the importance of reaching out to the international community.
Yeah. Get out there. Tell your story.
Yeah.
Build alliances.
Right. Make your case to the world. Remind everyone that Georgia matters.
That its success is important for the whole region.
Exactly. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into Georgia's struggle for Western integration, I think we're left with a mix of hope and uncertainty.
Yeah, a lot of questions.
Right. I mean, they've shown incredible resilience, but the road ahead is definitely bumpy.
And it really comes down to the choices that Georgia makes.
Right. The decisions their leaders make.
Will they cave to the pressure? Or will they find a way to overcome these obstacles and build a truly democratic, prosperous nation that's part of the West?
It's a story that's still unfolding, and we'll be watching closely to see what happens next. You know, Georgia's story really is a reflection of these bigger global struggles
Oh, absolutely.
between democracy and authoritarianism,
Mm.
between the rule of law and brute force.
It's a microcosm of all that.
And it reminds us that the fight for freedom, for a better future, is never truly over.
It's a constant struggle.
And it's something that deserves our attention, our support,
Absolutely.
because the choices these countries make, the challenges they face, they impact all of us.
They do.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating look at a different corner of the world.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.